Hi everyone. So now we're on the last chapter, which is called Chapter 13. It's a House Divided. So we're talking about the 1840s to the 1860s. It's through the period of the Civil War outbreak. I will give you guys at the end like a little bit of a synopsis of the Civil War, so that way you kind of have a little grasp of what occurred leading up to everything. So Chapter 13 explores a lot of the tensions between the North and the South, specifically over slavery, politics, and national identity. And ultimately that led to the Civil War. So the sectional conflict, as they call it, North and South. So the phrase "a house divided cannot stand," which was part of Abraham Lincoln's speech from 1858, it captured the central idea of the conflict that was occurring at this point in time, where the U.S. can't survive half slave, half free. It's not possible. So we cannot be divided. We cannot stand. If that's the case, then we'll all fall. So expansion westward also intensified the disputes of whether these new territories will allow slavery. So that was another highly contested topic at this point in time. The Compromise of 1850 was founded, which included the Fugitive Slave Act that we talked about before. So if a slave decided to escape and was found, they would have to be returned back home. So this temporarily eased tensions, but it also deepened divisions because the South was they needed the slaves to kind of support their identity and their economy. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the expansion westward. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was an act that was instilled in 1854. It repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed popular sovereignty to decide slavery in new territories. So what that meant is as new states were founded, they could decide whether they wanted to be slave or free, meaning that if they were free, they wouldn't have slaves. So this led to a violent conflict in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers called the Bleeding Kansas. So unfortunately, it's going to cause animosity and further internal conflict that occurred. In the 1850s, the Republican Party is emerging. So now we had like all these other parties. We talked about the Democratic Party. We talked about the Whig Party, previous Federalist, Anti-Federalist. In the 1850s, the Republican Party emerged. And they were a coalition that was opposed to the expansion of slavery. The Republican Party did not want it. Abraham Lincoln was the prominent leader of the Republican Party at the time, and he advocated the containment of slavery, and he wanted to preserve the Union. He didn't want the North and South to be divided, and he honestly, at this point in time, didn't want them to fight in a civil war, which would happen. In 1857, the Dred Scott case occurred. So that was the Supreme Court's case, Dred Scott versus Sanford, which basically ruled and it declared that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in territories. Remember, they made that decision up to the states, so the states could decide whether they wanted to have slavery or not. So this decision outraged Northerners and emboldened the Southern pro-slavery forces. So the Northerners were at that point where they didn't want slavery at all. They wanted to eliminate it. They were all about the abolitionist movement. The Southerners were, they were victorious because in this case, Dred Scott couldn't be seen as a citizen, despite the fact that, he was formerly a slave and free, and he wanted his freedom and rights and all those protections that come with it. But unfortunately, he couldn't get that. In 1859, there was another event that that occurred. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. It was aimed to incite a slave rebellion, but ended in failure, and it also ended in the execution of John Brown. Because basically, the Northerners did not want slavery. They didn't want it at all. They instilled a lot of these rebellions, just like the one on Harper's Ferry. John Brown was seen as a martyr to the cause, right? So he became a martyr to many abolitionists, and it heightened a lot of the sectional tensions between the North and the South because of it. In 1860, there was another election, a presidential election that occurred as well, and secession. So Lincoln's election without Southern support prompted Southern states to secede, forming the Confederacy. So if you remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. Republicans, they did not want slavery. They did not like slavery. Lincoln he opposed it, right? He did not want it. So he won the presidential seat without any votes in the South because the Southerners didn't care for the fact that he did not want slavery. But he won, despite the fact, right? So because of that, the South decided to secede from the Union. So what that meant is that they wanted to be seen as independent. They did not want to be seen as part of the North or part of the United States, a totally separate state or separate area. They're going to call themselves the Confederate States of America. They're going to be their title. which basically formed the Confederacy. Okay, so this chapter basically ends with the nation on the brink of civil war, basically due to the election and due to the fact that they were fighting over slavery. That was the topic. So the key themes in chapter 13 are the sectional divisions over slavery and political power, the compromises and conflicts that occurred, and just the growing identities, right? So we have the North not wanting slavery. We have Abraham Lincoln becoming president and not getting a vote in the South, and yet he's an ardent supporter of anti-slavery. So that kind of comes into play as well. So let's kind of briefly talk about Civil War, because Civil War is basically discussed in chapter 14, which unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to. So the Civil War occurred between 1861 and 1865, and it was defining conflict in American history. When you look at all of it, is one of the greatest wars that was fought on American soil between Americans. So fought between the northern states, also known as the Union, and the southern states, who are known as the Confederacy or the Confederate States of America. So at the core, the topic that was fought over was over slavery and the preservation of the United States as a whole, when you think about it. So the southern states wanted slavery. They wanted to protect their states' rights. And eventually they wanted the right to decide slavery themselves. And the North aimed to preserve the Union. They wanted the whole country to stay together, and they wanted to end slavery, okay? So there were major battles in the Civil War that were fought. So of course, Gettysburg, Antietam, Fort Sumner shaped the course of the war, which resulted in immense casualties, especially at Gettysburg, destruction between both the North and the South. President Abraham Lincoln's leadership, including his Emancipation Proclamation, reframed the war as a fight for freedom and equality, because this book is all about fighting for freedom. And we see every single chapter, somebody's kind of wanting freedom. And in this case, we're trying to give freedom and equality to the slaves, trying to give that freedom. In 1865, the Union emerged victorious against the Southerners. So slavery was abolished, and the country began the difficult process of Reconstruction. So rebuilding the nation, forming civil rights for all. And of course, the South wasn't happy with this. The South wasn't happy about losing their slaves either. So the Civil War fundamentally transformed the United States. It ended slavery, but it left long-lasting challenges that a lot of the people at this point in time were faced with. So race, equality, national unity all came to the forefront after the Civil War, and that's something that they would have to decide in the reconstructive phase. So this is something that if you guys take U.S. history beyond 1877, it starts from Reconstruction and goes up to modern day. So I highly encourage you guys to take that course if you can. But the main takeaway is to understand that with each of these chapters in this book, there's somebody wanting freedom, wanting some sort of liberty. And that kind of ended with the Civil War in this case, where people were vying for freedom. All right, take care, everybody. Thank you.